I'm Helen Haskell. I'm one of the steering committee members, and I am pleased to introduce our first speaker. We're very lucky to have Vinay Prasad from the Oregon Health and Sciences University, where he's an assistant professor of medicine. Vinay completed his fellowship in hematology and oncology at the NIH and the National Cancer Institute. His research is focused on health policy, evidence-based medicine, and clinical trial design. And he has sort of turned the research world and the Twitterverse upside down with some of his research on drug cost, bias in clinical trials, efficacy in proof of efficacy of current and past medical practices. He's co-author of a recently published book, which I highly recommend, called Ending Medical Reversal. Welcome, Vinay.
Thank you, Helen, for that very kind introduction. I was going to talk to you very briefly this morning about some of the politics of consumer advocacy, or patient representation, some of the promise and perhaps some of the pitfalls of disease constituencies. I should mention, I do have one financial disclosure, which is this book, but I like to make the point that if you write a book that was published by academic university press, as this book was, you think about all the hours you spent writing the book and all of the money you received, I think you'd prefer to have received minimum wage. So. This is the outline of what I'm going to talk a little bit about. I want to hit on these topics. The importance of the patient voice, sort of the range or plurality of patient opinions, representativeness, about the importance of speaking in the interest of the patient, and consumers and solutions. Okay, so I think all of us in this room will agree, and this is almost could go without saying, that consumer and patient voices are incredibly important in healthcare, particularly in healthcare today at this present moment. People who are consumers, who have experienced the healthcare system, have perspective that is not shared by others. As just one example, the benefits that consumers want from different drugs or devices are often far greater than what providers think is beneficial. As just one example, in a rheumatoid arthritis study, investigators found that what patients who suffered with RA thought was clinically important was 3 or 4 times greater than what was deemed clinically important in the pivotal studies that led to the approval of new agents. So I think that's very important to consider. In my field of cancer medicine, I want to show this graph, which is for a drug called imatinib, or Gleevec, which was developed now almost 15, 16 years ago. This is a figure that shows, as time has gone on, the year of diagnosis of a particular condition that CML treats, called CML. The graph shows the life expectancy of people who don't have CML but are the same age and gender, and the life expectancy of people with CML over time. And what you see is that CML was once a condition where, in the prime of life, you could only have 3 or 4 years of survival, whereas your life expectancy would otherwise have been 20 years. But as time has gone on, particularly with the advent of Gleevec, which came out about 1999, we've seen a huge narrowing of the gap, and we have life expectancy that is nearly normal in patients with CML. Why do I show this? I show this because this is a good drug, I think. I think this is what patients and consumers want from our healthcare system, and they want from innovation. And then in what follows, I'll show you what we're actually getting. This is a figure that looks at the different cancer drugs that have been approved over the last decade. We've had 71 drugs approved in solid cancers. And this is a bar graph, and each of these bars is one drug that was approved. And it's showing you on the top the improvement in something called progression-free survival, which is a surrogate endpoint, and on the bottom, the improvement in overall survival. And these are the 71 drugs in a row. And this is 2, 4, 6, 8, 2, 4, 6, 8. The median improvement in progression-free survival has been about 2.3 months from a new cancer drug approved.
So the x-axis is months?
The y-axis is months, yeah. Y-axis is in months, that's correct. That's very important to say. The median improvement in overall survival of these drugs has been 2.1 months. And many of these drugs we don't know, and that's why there's no bar listed. I think consumers may want better than this. There are a number of reasons why what I showed you just there was a bit optimistic. The reality may be a bit more sobering than even that. This is a figure that looks at the age of patients on pivotal trials that led to the FDA drug approval that was published by the FDA itself for cancer studies. You'll see that cancer is a disease of the elderly. The percent of patients over the age of 65, of all the people with cancer in the United States, most are over the age of 65, about 60%. About 50% are over the age of 70, about 30% are over the age of 75. Those are the tall bar graphs here. The shorter bar graph shows you the percent of patients in pivotal trials that are over these same ages. Even though 60% of cancer patients are over 65, only 30% of cancer patients in clinical studies are over 65. Only 20% are over 70, about 5% are over 75. We're approving drugs based on studies that are conducted in people that are younger, healthier, with fewer comorbidities than people in the real world. I believe that's concerning for the simple reason that as we extrapolate the data from people in younger, healthier individuals to older individuals, we don't always get the same results. And the results I've shown you in the slide before, that 2.1 months, those are the results in the younger, healthier people. So let's look at the results as we go into the real world. This is just one example of a clinical study, which is the approval of a drug called sorafenib in liver cancer. Now, you should know that prior to this approval in 2008, liver cancer, advanced liver cancer, was a very devastating disease. There were no approved FDA options. There were almost no drugs an oncologist could give a patient that would have any beneficial effect for this cancer. So when we saw these results in the upper left in 2008, a lot of oncologists celebrated. And what it shows you is that compared to best supportive care, the use of sorafenib improved median survival from about 8 months to 11 months. It was a modest improvement, but it was something where there had been nothing. Those of us who've used this medication over the last decade have noticed some things that are unique about it. It's not easy to give. As you give sorafenib to patients, many complain of side effects. They complain of fatigue. They complain of hand, foot rashes, pain, discomfort. A lot of people, of their own volition, decide not to take the medication. Just last year, Stacy Ducina from the University of North Carolina, they wanted to look at how does this drug perform in the real world. So I should make the point that in the clinical study, these patients were younger than the average age of liver cancer patients. They had almost no comorbid conditions. They had no other medical problems they were dealing with. They were really in terrific shape. As we prescribed this drug in the real world, we found that older and frailer patients often didn't do as well with it. So what they looked at here was a Medicare data set. They looked at all of the patients who received sorafenib, which is one of these curves. They found that whereas sorafenib was taken in the pivotal study for about 6 months, in the real world it was only taken for, on average, about 3 months. And compared to patients that were propensity score matched or otherwise very similar, there was no benefit of this drug in the real world. So I think putting these things together, we wrote this, I think, provocative article in JAMA Oncology recently, where we say that overall survival in cancer clinical trials may be a new surrogate endpoint for overall survival in the real world. So what do I mean by this? I think those of us in the room know, or we've heard about surrogate endpoints, which are things like your blood sugar or your blood cholesterol. A wise doctor once told me a surrogate endpoint is something that no patient thought was important until the doctor told them it was important. They're endpoints that people don't feel. They're numbers that people don't care about, but that doctors care a great deal about. And the doctors care a great deal about them because they're supposed to predict things people care about. And in oncology, we have several things that are surrogate endpoints. We have measures of shrinking of a cancer, measures of the rate at which cancer grows, which is called progression-free survival. But overall survival was always accepted as the gold standard. After all, if you made people live longer, is that not an unquestionable good? But what we've pointed out is, one, I think we'll all agree, the purpose of the FDA drug regulation is to approve drugs that improve outcomes for patients in the United States. I don't think anyone will dispute that. Most cancer drugs we've looked at have marginal survival benefits on the orders of about 2 months. A marginal drug in an ideal population may have no benefit in an actual United States population as people are older with comorbidities, and therefore overall survival in pivotal trials may merely be another surrogate endpoint for survival in the real world. And I should also mention cost. Are we paying what's fair and appropriate for these medications? These are two graphs that show the launch price cost of new drugs over time. cancer drugs are rising faster than other classes of medications, faster than other sectors of the economy. This is the median launch price per 1 month of treatment over time. In the 1970s, it was about $100. By 2000, it was about $5,000, which was thought to be unsustainable. Now, from 2010 to 2014, it's about $10,000. Now it's over $10,000. We're well past $10,000 per month. Unlike other sectors of the economy, competition has not brought down prices at all. Imatinib, that drug I showed you for CML, which is really a terrific drug, has been followed by 2 other drugs that basically do the same thing. And the price of imatinib over time, as nilotinib and dasatinib have been approved, has only risen. All of these drugs have had prices go up over time. Unlike any other sector of the economy where there's competition and prices fall, you don't see that in at least cancer drug prices and often other drug prices, but particularly cancer drug prices. Okay, so is that what we want? Is that what consumers want? That's what providers and corporations and regulators are deeming appropriate, but is that what consumers want? So I think that's the importance of the consumer voice, to clarify and push the field for better outcomes, better drugs. Now let me talk about some of these other points. The range of patient opinions. I think it is certainly the case that there are many patients who want to accept greater uncertainty and greater risk from new drug products and devices. But I also think there are many patients who want to accept greater certainty. In my clinical practice, I often see people ask me, what will this drug you've offered me do for me? And I can tell them sometimes, well, we know from the studies that have been done that it will shrink your cancer. And then they say, okay, that's great. I would prefer it to shrink, but will I live longer? Will I have less side effects? Will I have better quality of life? And I can't answer those questions because that data doesn't exist. Those patients I don't often hear of in news coverage of articles. I don't see, and I'll show you some data, we don't see a lot of them at the FDA Drug Advisory Committee meetings. The narrative from patients and consumers, at least in the media, is approve more often, based on greater uncertainty, and leave autonomy to patients. But that runs counter to a lot of people I see who are not very active, but who have strong feelings about their own health care. Just one example, we looked at 103 public speakers at the Drug Advisory Committee meeting. We found that 92.2% supported marketing approval, and only 6 did not. It's overwhelmingly skewed in favor of approving the drug. And I should point out, the Drug Advisory Committee meeting is a forum in which these are drugs that we have some genuine uncertainty about whether or not they should be approved. If there was not that genuine uncertainty, they would just be approved. They wouldn't even hold a meeting. All right, so I was thinking the other day about this question, and I thought about this problem. Why do we ban drinking and driving? On the one hand, I think it's very clear that once upon a time, we didn't ban drinking and driving. People were allowed to drink, and they were allowed to go on the road. And people thought of it as a question of personal autonomy. You're free to drink and drive, and someone else is not. We've quickly realized as a society that that's unsustainable because one person's choice to drink affects someone else down the road. It affects the risk of other people on the road, of passengers, of pedestrians. Is there a similarity in healthcare? So this got cut off. It looks good on my screen, but I apologize for this. So what I want to show you here is there's a spectrum of, I think, patient opinions. There are patients on one end of the spectrum who believe that we should approve more based on less efficacy standards. They are gaining greater voice, I think, this group. And there are patients on the other end of the spectrum, like patients I see in my clinic, who say, we actually need higher standards for approval. I want more information before doctors offer me drugs and devices. And we think about these two things as very disconnected, but perhaps there is a connection. When you approve things based on lower efficacy standards, we've conducted a study that shows that with about 5 years of follow-up, drugs approved on the basis of a surrogate are very rarely followed with better, robust studies that look at overall survival. This is a graph that shows of 36 drugs approved based on a surrogate, about 5 of them later showed overall survival benefits, about 11 of them or 12 of them did not. In well-done styles, they did not improve survival, and the rest of them, there were no good studies. There's many drugs out there that we still don't know the answer to with 5 years of follow-up. So when we approve based on lower efficacy standards, we don't answer the questions these patients want, even with 5 years of marketing. Does this hinder the ability of these people on this end to get more information about the drugs they want? Is there some analogy here to the drunk driving situation? It's not just about these patients having the right to do with their own body what they wish, which we all support, But in a way, they're restricting the rights of patients on the other end of the spectrum who want more information, because that information is practically never generated if we approve based on less and less evidence. Representativeness. This was our table of all of the people who went to the Drug Advisory Committee meeting and spoke on behalf of patients or consumers over a 5 or 6 year period of time. We looked at cancer drug advisory meetings, but I think they're comparable across other drug advisory meetings. We looked at all of the 103 people who went up to the microphone and spoke. We found, several interesting things. About half of them actually had the cancer in question. About a third of them had taken the study drug at some point in their time. About 56% of them, and there's some overlap here in these groups, they represented an organization. 2 of them were principal investigators on seminal trials. 30% of them voluntarily disclosed a financial association to the sponsor, often that their travel or their presence there at the meeting was paid for by the sponsor. 2 of them were found to have a financial association that was not disclosed because it is a voluntary disclosure. And about a fifth of them had the disclosure through an organization, whereas the rest of them had a personal disclosure. So why do I show this? Who is not speaking at these meetings? Who doesn't have their voice heard at the Drug Advisory Committee meetings? It's all the people who took the drug who have died. All patients with the condition who are not around to go to the meetings, who have suffered significant toxicity. There are people out there who have feelings about drug and drug approval processes, but they don't want to spend that time in the limited time we all have in our lives advocating for that on that issue, and I sympathize with that. But their voices are also not heard. It's skewed towards the people who want to come and speak at these meetings. In the case of the drug advisory meetings, I've shown you 96%, 92% wanted the drug approved. It's skewed towards positive conclusions. And I'll just have a few brief points, then I'll conclude. So always in the patient interest. I think we have to accept the reality that there is a sizable amount of industry influence in the sector of consumer representatives and patient advocates. We did a study where we looked at 68 patient advocacy organizations that were recommended by the National Comprehensive Cancer Network for patients to participate in. We found that 75 disclosed a median of 7 biopharmaceutical sponsors. The sponsors were often the only makers of drug products in that space. And again, these were largely voluntary disclosures. Matt McCoy recently in the New England Journal of Medicine, they looked at 104 patient advocacy organizations, not just cancer, but across different disease spectrum. They found that 83% received financial support from the industry. Only one of the organizations explicitly stated it does not accept industry support. Of the organizations that accepted donations, at least a third of them received more than $1 million. And a third of them had one member of a biotechnology industry on their own governing board. They had dual governance on Pfizer and for the governing board of the company, of the patient group. Why I think this is problematic is that we run into errors of omission and commission. Commission is we hear insistent lobbying for approving drugs based on less and less evidence. Omission is we often find these groups are strangely silent on certain issues. This was an article that came out of the New York Times. The furor over drug prices puts some of these groups in a bind, which are reluctant to comment about the unsustainable cost of cancer drugs or other drugs. This is Zeke Emanuel. Patient groups funded by drug makers are largely mum on drug prices. So there may be some errors in the representativeness and the comprehensiveness of the representation. So some brief solutions. I think we have to think very deeply about being able to capture empirically the range of patient opinions. We have to reach people who don't want to participate, who are reluctant to participate, and find out what do they want from their care. People who live in rural communities, people who are not active in groups, people who are sick or ill or dying and are unable to come to meetings and participate. We have to think about better ways to survey a representative group of patients. One of the solutions we've offered is that in drug advisory committees, rather than have patients come to the microphone, the patients who've lived and done well, we can take video diaries of everyone who's been on the study, and they can record their progress. And we can play some videos at the meeting of people who've done well and people who may not have done well. We can collect videos of patients who are told they're not eligible for clinical trials. What was their experience like? Should their experience have some role in the decision-making around drug approval? I believe that would be very useful and interesting information. About patient interest, I think we need more transparency in advocacy funding. We need to remove simultaneous board membership with the pharmaceutical or device industry. I think as a general picture, we have to rethink the strategy of funding, but I understand that in the reality of these fiscal climates is there are not many alternative sources of funding in many cases. But I think we have to be more open and upfront about what are the implications and potential trade-offs by these relationships. And so I think we're going to have a discussion for a while, but thank you so much for having me.
So, thank you very much, Vinay. We're going to have about half an hour of discussion and question and answer. There's a microphone over here on the left if you have a question, if you want to just go line up at the microphone. There's a microphone down there if you want. Or we can share. Might be easier.
I feel like it's echoing.
Just bring the microphone up here.
Okay, hi. I'm Ann
Okay.
Fonfa. I run a patient advocate organization called the Annie Appleseed Project. We focus on cancer and oncology issues. Throughout your talk, I kept thinking it's all about money. But then you came up with a brilliant solution, which is the live video or video recorded, because really I notice these days that anyone can do that kind of thing. And I've even done live video feeds from Facebook feeds from our conferences, so I know it's doable. It's a great solution because most people cannot afford the money or the time to get to Washington, D.C. Or Maryland to make comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Annie.
Hi, I'm Jean Selsky from Pecori. Boy,
Speak right into the microphone.
are you trying to say I'm short?
Sorry.
So, boy, you just laid a lot of stuff down here, which has been done recently a lot. And I really feel that we're not looking at this issue holistically. I think you've brought some really great solutions, but we're only looking at one side of the equation, and that's the patient side. We have a whole medical enterprise here where most physician organizations receive a significant amount of funding, as well as the research community, from non-governmental funding, from industry funding. And so I do feel that this is a little bit of a one-side discussion, and that we really have to holistically look at the problem of, if we can't diversify funding, how do we manage conflict of interest and make sure that those voices that we're not hearing are being heard. But to say that patient advocacy is any different than the American Academy of X, Y, and Z receiving CME coverage or travel, or when we look at our commissioners of FDA and what they have to diversify before they had those organizations, and they're all good people. I don't think that just hitting on the patient advocacy part is the real solution here. I think we have to talk about diversity of funding, mingling funding, making funding in foundations that have blind trusts, things like that, rather than pointing to one sector over another.
So I agree with that, actually, a tremendous amount. I think I'm very unpopular at oncology conferences for some of the work that we've done on all of the diverse issues. I think there's the professional organizations, which have tremendous conflicts of interest. There's the fee-for-service nature of healthcare, which is itself a tremendous conflict of interest. 85% of oncologists on clinical guidelines are funded by the pharmaceutical industry. 70% of oncologists on Twitter, we recently published. We see skewed recommendations towards more is more on almost every front of oncology. I think you're right. It's a systemic problem, and it needs a systemic solution.
And I will say that I gave a talk once at an NCCN meeting, and it was almost a revolution when people were arguing between surrogate endpoints and real endpoints. So this is an issue. I just wish people wouldn't compartmentalize it to different sectors. It just goes across the healthcare system.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. That was an amazing talk and insights. My name is Amy Verstappen. I'm here representing the International Society of Adult Congenital Heart Disease, and I'm also a consumer consultant for Cochrane. I do communications. So two things. One is I want to support the previous comment and just say that one of the huge gifts I got, helped start and run the patient advocacy organization for congenital heart patients for 13 years. When I started running the organization, I got amazing training from the National Organization of Rare Disorders in how to protect yourself from conflict of interest. So very concrete guidelines in why not to have your board the way you did, what to turn down. So in my time running my organization, I turned down a lot of funding and looked at, is it foundation funding, all those good things. So I think that we could have a really complicated conversation about that, more complicated. And I would love to see Q take on some of that organizational piece of how do you educate organizations, which segues into my next point, which is about education. So the other, if we're fleshing this out a little bit, for me, a huge piece of this challenge is how we educate or talk to patients about the care. And interestingly, in the past week, I had this specific experience where somebody called me because I work for Cochrane, who's managing cancer, actually somebody's husband, and basically the statistics they had been given were percentages. So they had been told, this will increase your chances of having remission by 10%. There's a huge amount of data that says that patients and people in general don't have good numeracy skills. I have a master's in education. I can tell you basically what you need to do, and I'm sure everybody in this room knows that. I changed it for that person from, I had him tell me the statistics, and I said, okay, so what they're saying is of 100 people, 10 of those people without the chemo will go on to continue and have cancer. But if you take the chemo, one more person, one out of that 100, will not go on to develop the cancer. And I think similarly, when you talk about 2 months, I have talked to so many cancer patients who will say, my doctor says this will give me a 20% longer lifespan. And if you say to them, but what's the N? They don't ask that. And I would also give a shout out to the patient advocacy organizations that I know good patient advocacy organizations really work on the education, because when you talk about what patients want, patients can only want what they're told. And we do a really bad job of giving concrete information that meet not just plain language standards, but literacy standards in this country.
Thank you. I think those are great points. I think it speaks to the idea of using patient decision aids. I think the Harding Center for Health Literacy has some really nice aids to visualize what you just did, what would happen to 100 people with the condition, to help facilitate better decisions.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it excellent. Oh, sorry. So tall here. I'm Jonathan Block from the MedShadow Foundation. I wanted to ask you a question regarding what you started off talking about, the clinical trials, about how the enrollment in those trials is not indicative of all of the real world. Do you think that's more of a problem because there aren't enough, for the example that you were showing in cancer patients, there aren't enough older patients that are willing to enroll in those trials? Or do you think it's more of the drug companies thinking that if they have a more healthier population than the people who will actually be using the drugs, that they're going to get more favorable results? And what sort of ideas do you have for getting or for having clinical trials that enroll patients that are more indicative of the population that will actually be taking the drug?
Thanks for that question. The question was, I haven't heard it.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess the question is the reason the trials are not representative of something about the people who are older and frailer may not want to be on trials, or is it that the companies have a disincentive to enroll them on the study? I think it is the latter, because I think that we've seen there are many different sort of circumstantial examples, but when we've asked the industry to do something and we change the bar and we set the bar X, the industry will do it. If the industry has no incentive to do it, they will not do it. We see that with diabetes and cardiovascular trials. Once we set the bar that you have to do a cardiovascular study and to exclude an increase of 20%, all of the drugs had those studies done within a very short period of time. If we, as we proposed in that paper, changed overall survival from a full regulatory approval to an accelerated approval, if trials are not representative, we would have a leverage on the industry to do those studies in a short period of time. So I think it is a carrot and stick approach, but I don't think it has, and I doubt that it has something to do with the patients, but rather with the incentives of the trials.
I'm Cynthia Sitkov. Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. I sit on the Central and Nervous System Advisory Committee at the FDA as a voting member, a voting patient representative. I'm here actually not in that capacity for the Q conference, where I was a consumer panelist for the new guidelines for disease-modifying therapies in MS. But I wanted to make a comment. When you spoke about testimony that patients or caregivers give during the FDA drug approval process, I've heard a great deal of very moving testimony from patients, from family members who have people who have actually died as a result of the drug trials. When it comes to voting on a particular drug, the testimony from those people who have been fortunate enough to get a slot, because it's not that easy to get a slot to testify. It's often done by a lottery, plays almost no role in how I vote. As moving as the testimony is, I'm voting really based on the evidence and the evidence that has been supplied to us. So, you know, I don't know if, sometimes I think I'm going to get incredible pushback from consumer groups and patient groups, but that's just the way it is. I'm voting on the evidence. So I just wanted to make that point.
I think that's an excellent point, and I'm sure that there are many people on the committees that vote strictly on the evidence, but I doubt that it has no role at all, that the what you hear at the microphone, because I think, as you pointed out, it's very powerful. And we've had, one example would be the Sarepta drug, the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy drug. Had it not been for the testimony, that is an easy, this drug barely improves a Western blot detection of a protein. Had it not been for the testimony. Had it not been for the testimony, the media coverage would be a different narrative. I think the testimony is powerful in ways that are not very easy to identify. And it really sets the narrative at a national level, especially for that drug, the Duchenne's drug. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for that presentation. My name is Eileen Karina, and I'm with Pulse Center for Patient Safety, Education, and Advocacy, formerly Pulse of New York. And we're a grassroots patient safety organization. For 20 years, we've been working with survivors of medical injury, using their stories for better outcomes, holding support groups. We advocate at the bedside for patients and families. So I have two questions about what you spoke about. First, we go into high schools and middle schools talking about medication. One of the first things we talk about is medication and communication. Those are the areas we cover. Understanding that young people are getting medication, but they don't understand it, and yet they're supposed to be adults that are understanding medication, and for many different reasons, but to get to know their medication, and that it's a serious topic to be talking to an adult about. My second question, with no humor involved, that $1 million from the pharmaceutical companies, we would love to get some of that money. And the truth is, as long as we could follow our mission, I'm curious, and I've been reading a lot about groups who are being ostracized for taking that money, but I'm curious, what are they taking that money for? Are they compromising their mission? And we contract with hospitals and healthcare organizations, and we would be happy to work with them on projects that we're working on and take some of that money. So I'm just curious, why is it so automatically a negative if they're not compromising their missions?
So I think you make a good point that I don't think it is automatically negative if they're not compromising the missions. I think there are a few things to say. One, bias is very subtle in ways that we don't always appreciate, and there have been a number of studies that show even the receipt of small gifts can have influence on the person in ways that they're hard to articulate, and the person may not even see that in their own lives. I mean, I'm sure I've been influenced by, different things, including, obviously I'll never say anything bad about my employer for one thing, But the second thing I'd say is that you're right. There are organizations that have very clear and specific missions. There's some organizations that use the money in ways that we may all question. For instance, a lot of the organizations receive lots of industry support and turn that out and give heavy grant support to investigators who no longer declare a conflict with the company. Some organizations, I mean, we're talking about many, many millions of dollars in money that is being given to investigators, leading to, lavish events that have no disclosure. And it appears that it is a way to bypass traditional disclosure mechanisms in some groups. There's a range of groups. I mean, there are tremendous groups, and there are groups that are questionable, just as they are in anything. So I think, but it's an excellent point. I don't think it automatically should be disqualified.
Hi, I'm Mike Weinberg. I'm part of the Association for the Protection of Cancer Patients. We try to dispel myths about cancer treatments in particular. Going on what I think one of the other questioners talked about was, or asked about was how do we better communicate in plain language to somebody whose family member who themselves has a grim diagnosis? How do we say, actually, so what I've noticed on government websites, they will say there's low quality evidence that this works. They won't say it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And sometimes, a lot of times it doesn't work, or they'll say that the low quality evidence and they won't say that, okay, the evidence was in petri dishes, that it was in an uncontrolled trial, that it was a case report. And how do we say, just finally say this doesn't work? I've noticed on your Twitter that in 140 characters, you will often say something very clear like that.
So I sympathize with you, and I think that we have the two ends of the spectrum are, this works, this is fantastic, I would do this, you should not say no, to this is low value, it's a choice. Why is not the other end of the spectrum, this doesn't work, I would never do it, I would never give my family member that. So I think we have to be bolder about saying, as you put it, if something really doesn't work, has no net benefit, that is not a low value, that's a no value proposition. And I think, I'm willing to say it, but I think, and there are lots of times as doctors that I think doctors offer things that they would not even undergo themselves. They would not allow a family member to undergo, just to feel as if they want just to offer something. And I think we have to be, work on communication on the doctor side too, to be very clear about, those sorts of things, and that they, to even say, I would not do this myself. But I sympathize with you. It can't be do this or low value. It has to be do this, and the whole range extends to don't do this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Yanling Yu. I appreciate your talk, especially about your suggestion to bring more patients and family members' voice to FDA's hearing, especially from the other spectrum. Related, I'm also serving on a FDA pulmonary and allergy committee. I'm a consumer rep. And in one hearing, we have a drug that specifically targeted one disease. And we had lots of patients and family members submitted testimonies, very moving testimony, videos, and written testimony, and pages we have to review it. However, the absence are those people or patients that also in a trial that are not effective to them, and also had anaphylaxis and other side effects. So it turned out at the end, the voting, I was the only one voted that not approve the drug. based on the risk and also didn't prove, very effective. It costs a lot to consumers. But I'm not here to speak in a capacity as a consumer rep on the FDA, just as a consumer. So my question to you is that do you have any insights as to how we can bring more consumers and family members from the other side of the extreme to let them know the opportunity or help support them to come to the FDA hearing? Because as committee members, we sit there, this is all we hear from one side of people really want to, they believe that work for them. But there are other side, like you point out rightly, there are other side effects, a lot of them didn't work to them. So do you have any suggestions how we can do that even with this group? We can get the message out, to bring more different opinions and perspective come to the hearing.
Yeah, I guess it's a great question. The question is, how do we actually get the voices to be heard? And I think it's not easy because one, there's a huge information asymmetry. For instance, the company knows everyone on the study and they can reach them all. We don't. I mean, there's no public way to know that information. So I think the only solution could come from a few things. One, the FDA could actually try to contact individuals and encourage them, or it has to go through the FDA because, it is some confidential patient information. That would be one avenue. Two, for some of these trials, especially drugs that are approved based on how people feel or function rather than survival, the FDA could mandate the use of video diaries. That every time you're seeing a person, of course with with proper informed consent, to ask if they want to do the video diary and mandate that they have that discussion, just as you would collect their adverse events and code it on paper. But I think it would have to come through a regulatory channel because it is very difficult to reach people who've gotten the drugs if you don't know what their names are, where they are.
Yeah, I think your suggestion about bring videos, submit videos. The difficulty I found is to get the news out so people know there is a hearing out there.
Right,
so
right.
you have a way to present
And
your
to
view.
fund
I
them.
see.
Yeah.
I propose that the FDA collects all the videos and then just picks 7 to air at the meeting. That it would be done in some central way.
That sounds good.
Right.
So we've got about 5 minutes
Thank
left. Thank you, Yenling. If you all could sort of make your comments brief, that would be great.
Thank you very much. I am a consumer through the founder of the Cherub Foundation. I'm currently serving with the American Academy of Neurology vaccine panel. I've been standing here for so long. I had an original question, and now I have 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll keep it brief. I originally came up to say that, with the evidence-based, and I do respect evidence-based healthcare, but when you deal with rare disorders, which I have a lot of parents in my group who have children with very rare disorders, and I'm sure some with cancer, even though I deal with communication impairments, there's less evidence because there's less studies. And I really do believe that there needs to be, when there's comments like that, consumer opinions, how passionate as they are, don't matter. They do matter. They do, because the parents that don't have the evidence to go by, I just respect Q so much for what they do and giving us a voice. And I love your suggestion about the videos. And I think that in addition to that, there should be SurveyMonkey so that you can have graphs and everything to show what the consumers are saying, because I agree with everyone who said it's sometimes difficult for people to get to the conference, especially if they're very sick or their families. A lot of these families don't have a lot of money. So it's more of a comment.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Ingina Lithcott, breast cancer liaison for the Black Women's Health Imperative. And I just wanted to make a statement that that when you said in response, thank you for your comments. When you said in response to a question, you listed some potential conflicts of interest. I wanted just to say that in terms of governmental funding for research, that there when universities receive governmental money for research, and that universities are expected to provide methodological and ethical oversight of that research, that there's a conflict of interest because universities receive indirect cost recovery. I just didn't want us to forget that.
Indirect what? Say it again.
Cost recovery.
Cost recovery.
In other words, when you get a $1 million grant, your university gets another
Oh, yeah.
to $750,000, which provides for most universities a third of their funding: tuition, indirect cost recovery, and donations.
Yeah, that's
So
a
I
great,
just wanted
that's
to
a great
put that
point.
out
The
there.
indirects on the, and that's also why the NIH funding is so coveted, and a lot of foundations that put strict limits on indirects are not as coveted, and that also probably allows for the bias of investigators with a lot of NIH funding get a lot of leeway in terms of conduct or other things of that nature.
That's interesting.
Yeah, John Santa. In
Hey,
a
John.
prior life, I worked for Consumer Reports, and I just wanted to say, I think some of our finest moments were when we said drugs were bad, hospitals were bad, doctors were bad, preventive tests were bad. Now, we could get away with that because we had a great brand, we had a great process. It is risky. There's a lot of other organizations I see in this room that have done that, you know, but it is incredible how hard you have to try. I mean, it amazes me to think that ACOG said in the 80s that elective delivery of children before 39 weeks was dangerous and shouldn't be done. And it was still being done widely until a couple of years ago, and now I think it's gone. So, you know, somehow I think we should develop a process to give courage to organizations who say no, and enable them to do it more emphatically. I think the media will cover it, but you gotta have, you know, one of the problems with researchers is they then say, well, you know, they put all kinds of conditions on it. No, you've got to say no.
Thank you, John.
Very well put, yeah.
I'm going to be brief. I'm
We should have
Marianne
lined you
Napoli.
up by height.
I'm Marianne Napoli from the Center for Medical Consumers, which doesn't exist anymore. I want to go back to something you said, Vinay. But the chart, you know, about would I take this drug myself, 1 to 10. I suggest that we do what the pain people do, you know, rate your pain, and you could have a visual that went with one part, I would take this drug myself, right up to I wouldn't give it to my worst enemy. And that would be clearer than perhaps than the statistic.
Thank you, Marianne.
So I just want to do a couple of shotgun responses to what you said. Okay, so one thing is I don't think it's necessarily bad that people over 65 who have most of the cancer are underrepresented in trials because they may very likely have comorbidities, right? And then they die of other things, and you end up with a small sample, so you have an intent to treat analysis, right? And you end up with very few people who actually make it through treatment for the actual cancer. And then you still don't have the answer that you want, right?
I think you do have the answer you want, which is that if you had this drug in the real world and you gave it to people, will people live longer? That's the only answer I want. And so if the reality is that people have other things that get in the way of that outcome, then knowing that I think is good, because then this is a drug that has side effects but no benefit. But I do think that the narrative is that you know efficacy only by looking at people who have nothing else that'll get in the way. But that's not the question I think that matters. It's if you put this drug in America tomorrow, will Americans be better off? And I think that comes with no restriction on clinical trials.
Okay, but I still want to know what's the effect on cancer, not if people are dying with heart disease and other things, right?
I guess the question you want to know is, will someone live longer or live better? Those are only two questions. Whether the cancer or something else gets in the way.
Okay, and then in terms of the drugs that you chose, so you have one that's a targeted treatment, right, BCR-ABL. And do you think precision medicine is going to change this whole scenario? So there you have, you know, a very specific target, and then you have sorafenib, which is not a specific target, it's, right?
Yeah, so I guess we have,
So
time is up.
I think there's some manipulation.
I'll just say that I wrote an article in Nature called The Precision Oncology Illusion, which I think will kind of hits on this topic.
Okay, and then, okay, so that's a whole other discussion. But I also have heard about FDA's real-world evidence initiative, that apparently they're going to be proceeding in a different way. Can you talk about that?
I think we'll have to take that question privately, but thank you very much to Vinay.